Welcome back, everybody, to Lab 4. Today we're going to be talking about how to write an introduction section in your papers. So as the agenda for today, first we're going to go over that variable selection and the types of analyses that you're going to be running and the hypotheses you might have based on what variables you chose from the survey that you did. Then we're going to talk about how to write an introduction and then follow it up with how to run a t-test in SPSS, that review from your statistics. As one of your assignments for the paper that you had to complete a couple weeks ago, you were supposed to choose a variable of interest, or two variables of interest specifically. And you chose one of two options. The first option was to choose two continuous variables. We've talked about the difference between continuous and categorical a few times. So continuous variables might be things like sleep quality and depression. And if you chose this option, you're choosing those two continuous variables because you're going to do a form of correlation analysis. As a reminder, a correlation analysis is where you're seeing if the variance, the change, the variability in one continuous variable, how much it shifts, is that systematically related to the change and variance in the other. As one shifts, is there some observable change in the other that makes them related to each other? And you could reframe this as, do changes in one variable relate to changes in the other variable, as I just said. So the variance, systematic, that's more of the technical side, the really understanding the theory behind what a correlation is doing. But in more of layman's terms, just a casual conversation, it is, do changes in one variable relate to change in the other? The second option you could choose is to have one categorical and one continuous. So this might be sleep quality, which is that continuous variable again, versus year in school, which is a categorical variable. There's different levels that are clearly distinct, different groups that are clearly distinct. And for this, one option is to do a t-test analysis. A t-test is looking at whether the variance in the continuous variable systematically relates to the level or the group in that categorical variable. So our changes in your continuous, this kind of flow and change, this variance, is that in some way attributed to which group your participants are in? You could say this again in layman's terms, do scores in one group differ from scores in the other group? You're comparing those two groups to see, is there overall some difference between them? So you chose one of these two options, and today we're going to talk about how to kind of convert those into hypotheses. If you chose the option one, which is the correlational two continuous variables, if that was your option, then the hypothesis you're coming up with is trying to predict how those two variables are related. Again, if one changes, does the other change in a systematic way? And there's a couple of different ways this could come about. You could have a positive relationship where you see that as x increases, so that's, one variable increases, how does the other change? Does it also increase? You could have the inverse of the negative relationship, whereas one increases, the other decreases. There's kind of opposite effects, but still related to each other. Or you could have no relationship where one variable is changing, has lots of variance, but that variance has no systematic relationship to the other variable. So as one changes and the other one's different in some way, we're not really clear. And we've seen how this looks in your lecture video. You see kind of those trends where you see an upward trend or a downward trend. Like in the example on the slide right here, this would be a positive relationship where you have the number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets, and it is positively correlated with total revenue generated by skiing facilities. And that's the problem with correlations. There's always a correlation does not imply causation. Just because two variables are related doesn't necessarily mean that, or they're statistically related, doesn't necessarily mean that there's a causation that one is actually affecting the other. So as part of a correlational hypothesis, you are kind of guessing at the relationship, but you still want to couch it in theory. It needs to make sense why these two variables are related. So the example that's a little bit more of a real world example that might actually happen, as a person's level of extroversion increases, do their number of Facebook friends also increase? So this is your hypothesis that yes, as one increases, the other would also increase. So this would be a positive relationship. And you always want to be thinking about what's your independent variable and dependent variables. Remember, we talked about the independent variable is the thing you're measuring or manipulating, whereas the dependent variable is kind of that outcome effect that you're always measuring. So in this example with the correlation, you would see that the independent variable, the kind of cause or the theoretical causation here, is the scores on that extroversion scale. More extroverted people or less extroverted people. And then as that level of extroversion shifts, it would have an effect on the dependent variable, which in this case is the number of Facebook friends. And you see again that they are both continuous, and that's why we're doing a correlation. Now, if you chose option 2, which is one continuous and one categorical, then in this case, your hypothesis is focused on whether which group the participant is in helps predict what their scores are going to be and some differences between those scores. So will group A show a higher score on X, which is your continuous variable, than group B? So in this example, we have blueberry pies will be rated as tastier on average than strawberry pies. Again, thinking about your independent variable, which is the thing that's being manipulated, and then your dependent variable, the thing that's being measured, we have the independent variable as the type of pie. This is your categorical variable where you have two groups here, the blueberry pies and the strawberry pies. And you're trying to see is the difference between these groups related to some systematic variance in the dependent variable, which is your taste ratings, always going to be a continuous variable. Now, I do want to note that I'm talking about t-tests, and for your project, we're expecting you to do a t-test. However, if you do want to do a little bit more advanced analysis and run more than just two groups comparing to each other, then you need to run an ANOVA. You might remember this from statistics that when it's just two groups comparing to each other, that is going to be a t-test, but more than two groups, there's a little bit more error introduced between those groups, so you have to do a special kind of analysis called an ANOVA, which is basically doing lots of mini t-tests and aggregating those scores. So this is something to talk to your TA about as you're going on. Of course, you're free to ask me as well, but think about, am I comparing two groups, so freshmen versus seniors, male versus female, or are you doing more like blueberry, strawberry, and rhubarb pie? So we've talked about the kind of hypotheses you might have based on whether you're choosing option 1 or option 2, but everybody is going to have to write an introduction. So here we'll get into how you should kind of go about putting an introduction paper together. An introduction paper is where you are communicating your point. What is the research topic? Why are you interested in this? And what do you think is going to happen? And so your outline should reflect this. When writing an introduction, your first paragraph is always to introduce that research topic. You're telling the reader what you are going to be studying, why it's important to understand, and kind of a little hint about what you're expecting and what they're going to read for the rest of the article. You then go into developing the background. This is where you provide a review of the literature, what's been done before, what are gaps in the literature, what does the reader need to know before going into the rest of the paper and kind of seeing what your actual study is. And this is generally about 3 to 5 paragraphs, let's say approximately 4 paragraphs. That's because each paragraph is kind of talking about a different form of relationship between the variables, really explaining and building upon the logic that you're using for why it's important and why these variables might be related to each other. You might find that each paragraph is dedicated to a past research article. And in fact, that's kind of what you're going to be doing, where each paragraph is a little bit of a mini review of one paper that has been that has shown evidence for what you are studying and why you think your variables are related. And then once you've developed that background, given a lot of context for what your research study is going to be, then you're going to state your purpose, your rationale, and your hypothesis. So this is now that we have all the information about these variables that we need, and we know what's been done before, what do you think is going to happen in your study? What is your hypothesis? What is your question that you are trying to answer, that if you find your question is correctly answered, or that the answer to your question is what you expect, how does that inform a theory? So the first paragraph I've talked about a little bit already, but this is where you're explaining that broad topic. What is the big issue or problem that you are trying to address? Why do we care about these variables? What is the general question, the general theory we're thinking of? Now, sometimes this starts off with a quote to kind of hook the reader, maybe a definition. We want to avoid quotes too much, but it's nice to get a little hook so that the reader kind of jumps in. You also talk about a statement of the problem, something interesting to really get across what your broad topic is going to be. You also very much want to make sure that this intro paragraph names your variables. The reader should not leave your first paragraph confused about what you are going to study or thinking you might be studying something else that it turns out they're wrong later. What are the two variables you're exploring? It should be very clear by the end of this paragraph. And if it isn't, then you need to kind of readdress it and make sure you're not adding too much or too little. So here's an example of a brief introduction paragraph. I'm going to read it aloud and we'll kind of walk through it. So, individuals differ radically from one another in the degree to which they are willing and able to express their emotions. So we see there a very clear kind of hook. All right, that is a bold statement that's been said. I'm interested in this. Oh, in differences in expressing emotions, I'm curious. Then the paragraph goes on. In particular, previous research has demonstrated that men and women often express emotional reactions differently. And here we have a citation, this in-text citation, which we talked about last week, from Smith and the 2006 article. We don't see any title of the article, any journal name, just the last name and the year. Now, while research has shown that men and women display both anger and sadness to different degrees, that is also something that was found in the Jones, Miller, and Stone 2003 article, less is known concerning how anxiety or expressions of anxiety differs as a result of gender. Again, another statement that's probably backed up by Jones, Miller, and Stone. Anxiety is a common emotion that is prevalent in both men and women. Furthermore, it is a precursor to certain mental health concerns such as depression and panic disorder. Again, Adams there. And by now we've gone over a lot of the main points that are going to be brought up. It is clear that we are studying emotional expression and studying individual differences here. So the final statement, really making sure it hits home. As such, it is important to explore gender differences in the expression of anxiety. Again, we see gender is a variable that is very clear, this individual differences, but specifically gender. And then the other continuous variable of anxiety or expression of anxiety. There is no question here about what the individual is going to be studying, what this researcher is studying, and it has a lot of context to give a brief background introduction. And what I would expect as a reader is to see the next few paragraphs to go in a little bit more into the Smith, the Jones, and the Adams papers so that we can learn more about men and women emotional expressions and anger and sadness, and why don't we know more about anxiety differences in gender and panic disorders. I'm going to learn more about that so that when I get to the final paragraph, I'll be able to see what does the researcher think are going to be the differences, the gender differences in the expression of anxiety. All of that is encapsulated into this one introduction paragraph. Again, the goals you should be thinking about: explain the broad topic and name the variables of interest. All right, so the middle paragraphs that you're launching into, good for you. You will have already done this part. So right now you're working on your literature review. It's going to be due in a week, but you are really just kind of working towards the future. Present you is helping the future you, because the middle paragraphs are basically just a literature review. This is where you are reviewing the findings from the previous studies. You have maybe 3 articles that you're looking at, and you have about 1 paragraph per article. This is showing what the work, what has already been done, where there's differences in understanding between different researchers, what are some compare and contrast, ways that they haven't agreed, ways they've used different methods, ways that they have agreed with each other, and so you have backed up this theory and you have ideas. So you want to talk about the past, the previous literature, review that literature. And for each article, you should include in that paragraph what was the purpose of that article, What did the researchers think was going to happen, their hypotheses? What did they do, and what did they actually find through their results? You want to make sure you're hitting the link between them. What is the theory that is explaining all the studies or bringing them together that is informing your theory? And again, do they have similar or different methods? Something we talked a lot about in Lab 3. How do they build on each other, create that glue between the articles? This literature review should not feel like it's 3 individual paragraphs that have nothing to do with each other. There should be transitions between them and showing a kind of flow of logic of, well, this researcher found this, which is interesting, but then this researcher found this, which is also interesting, and then this researcher found something that agreed with one a little bit, but agreed with the other in some way, and brings our thoughts in a different pattern to inform our theory. That kind of thing you're going to be looking at is making sure there's a story behind the articles that you've put together. Why do they inform each other? Why do they create what you think is the hypothesis that you're about to share with us? Because that's what you do in your last paragraph. Here is where you state your purpose, rationale, and hypothesis. So you are summarizing briefly what you found from the reviews. What was the big theory that all of these researchers kind of led you to think was the way that 2 variables are related to each other, or 2 conceptual variables are related to each other, and what still needs to be done? What is the purpose of this article that you are writing, this research study you're doing? Because if everybody's answered everything there is to know about the theory, then why do you need to do more research? There's always more questions. So what question are you addressing? And that's where you come in with your hypothesis, where you're specifically stating how do you think that the variables you are going to be studying are related to each other, and why do you think that? That's the rationale there. It is one thing to state that you believe something. It's another to make sure that the reader agrees with you, or at least has enough information to understand why you believe in that hypothesis. And this is something we will be looking for in your introduction. Not just a 1 sentence, I think this is what's going to happen, but that rationale as well. So you might have a hypothesis that says, consistent with the prior literature on gender and emotional expressiveness, the current study predicted something, and you would state there what the hypothesis is. Or after review of recent literature on anxiety and depressive symptoms, the current study hypothesizes ... Here you'll see that you have that predicted and hypothesizes words. Those are clear indicators that you are about to state your hypothesis, and this is something we'll also be looking for. It should be very clear when you state your hypothesis, your question. So I recommend you always start the delivery of your hypothesis with that word predicted or hypothesize. Make it very clear, and then make the rationale very clear as well. We think, or after reviewing this is the conclusion we've come to. In that last paragraph, remember that your hypothesis should also reflect whether you're doing a correlation or a t-test, which we're calling the analysis plan. If you have a correlation, you want to make sure it's clear what you think the relationship between the 2 variables will be, that positive, negative, or no relationship. And you want to make sure that the strength is there if you think there is going to be a strong or weak. You don't have to be exact, like you don't need to see a moderately weak or a moderately strong, just kind of a general idea of how you think they'll be related. So in this example, we have explicit self-esteem is predicted to have a strong and positive association with risk proneness. So this would have been an article about how people who think of themselves positively might be more likely to take risks because they feel kind of confident in themselves. That's a hypothesis, and maybe it'll be backed up in the data, maybe it won't. But whatever it is, the researcher needed to explicitly state what they thought was going to happen. Now, if you're doing a t-test, remember this is comparison of groups. So here you'll have an example of men are expected to show greater emotional expressiveness than women. It is very clear what your 2 groups are, men and women in this example, and it is clear what your continuous variable is, that emotional expressiveness. The IVs and DVs show up in your hypothesis. And make sure that if you're doing a t-test, you do have 2 groups from your categorical variable. A reminder that if you were doing an ANOVA, You can you have more groups, and so you don't have to be as explicit about the two groups. You just need it to be explicit about what the categorical variable will be. Now that you know the flow, that number of paragraphs you need, you have the opener, you have the content, that literature view in the middle, and then you have your closing where you give the hypothesis. Now you want to remember some other things about how you're writing it. So first, citations. Make sure to use those in-text citations throughout. We do not want to plagiarize. We want to make sure that all of the credit for the ideas are given to those who came up with the ideas. If it is not your own internal thought, then make sure there's a citation for it. Your hypothesis is your own internal thought. You do not need to cite a hypothesis, but you do need to have these in-text citations throughout your literature review, maybe in your opener paragraph like we saw in the example. Make sure you have that information. You also need to include a reference page at the end. This is its own page that references all of those in-text citations. For every in-text citation you have, there should be a matching reference, APA style, on your reference page and vice versa. Nothing on your reference page should not be included in your text. Avoid quotes. Now, I did say that you could have maybe a hook opener quote. That's more okay. But throughout your paragraphs, throughout your introduction, it shouldn't be many quotes or any quotes that are appearing there. Just that hook, maybe. Again, be very careful with this. Lean towards not quoting. And then if you do, for some reason, just really desperately need to do it, make sure that you're doing the in-text citation appropriately, where you're saying exactly where that quote was located so somebody could find it. You can use your APA manual or Purdue OWL, which is the online website. Just Google Purdue OWL APA, and it'll show you a little bit more about how to do these in-text citations if you were confused at all from the Lab 3. You can also look at our old lab PowerPoints, of course, as resources for doing these citations. You also want to consider your writing style. So make sure to use plain, simple, but formal language, not your conversational language. You might just be talking to a friend. So formal is the examined or investigated, the current study explored. It kind of feels more researchy there. Whereas informal is, oh, we looked at, we tried to find out, we wanted to know. Those are just kind of casual conversation. You want to use a very systematic, formal language and try to find the best word or the least number of words. Explain it as concisely as possible. You also want to use active voice. So you might remember from your English courses that an active voice is where the subject of the action comes at the beginning of the sentence. Whereas passive voice, which is the opposite, is putting the subject somewhere hidden inside your sentence. So a passive voice might be, the study was completed with 60 adults aged 20 to 40. Well, who completed this study? Was it those, okay, it's those adults, or was it the researcher, or who was doing this? Oh, okay, no, active is the 60 adults aged 20 to 40 completed the study. You see how you took the subject, those 60 adults, and put them right at the beginning so the reader knows who is doing the action. The rule of thumb that I learned when I was getting active and passive in my head was, if you can add by zombies anywhere in your sentence, that means that it is a passive voice. So the study was completed by zombies. That's your silly passive voice there. Whereas active, you can't fit that in anywhere. Just really think about, is the subject of my sentence at the beginning of the sentence or not? Also be specific. Don't use ambiguous terms like things and stuff and ideas. Those don't really mean anything. We kind of throw out those terms in casual conversation as filler words that we're not quite as clear on what we're describing, so you want to make sure you cut those out. Be very explicit about what ideas or what variables you are talking about. Also, make sure that whenever you use this or that or it, what is it actually referencing? What are you actually talking about? Sometimes we can put in a sentence that says, this means, or this finding suggests, well, which finding are we talking about? Always be explicit there. Sometimes we use this and that as a carryover in our second sentence, thinking that we're referencing something in the previous sentence. Avoid that. Make sure every sentence kind of stands alone. The reader doesn't have to have gone backwards to remember what you're talking about in each sentence. Just be explicit. A solution for your writing style to make it better, I always suggest that you try reading what you wrote out loud. That means you can hear yourself more, turning it into conversation and seeing if there's any speed bumps. Do you get lost in the middle of a sentence? And would somebody who's listening to you get confused because it's too long and kind of rambling and maybe references a lot of different pieces of information that it's confusing to keep together? Well, that's a cue that you may need to split it. If you are having trouble taking a breath between a sentence, I'll just split it into 2 sentences. Do you get lost in the middle because you're a little confused? Well, maybe reread it or rewrite it for clarity. Make sure you're a little bit more explicit. You're not using that's and references to previous ideas. The standalone nature of it, you want to add that clarity. Again, do you need to take a breath? That might mean it's too long. You also always want to be thinking about, could somebody who isn't a psychology major or studying behavioral science, would they understand what you are talking about in this? Because you do want this, what you're writing about, to be accessible to a major audience. You don't want to have a lot of jargon, which are very specific terminology that only people who really understood and had expertise in the subject would understand. You want to put it in accessible terminology that's very clear. Also, make sure you do not just write a first draft and submit that. You want to write it, then read through it yourself, again, aloud, I think is a really good way to do it, and then repeat. And you can get some edits from the Writing Center if you need some help, but you should go through this process of reading, proofreading, proofreading a few times to make sure that it's all whittled down. Always make sure to check for those spelling errors as well. On a higher level kind of piece of advice that I use for this proofreading and reading it to yourself, something that really helped me when I was an undergrad was actually reading your paper backwards. So starting with the last paragraph and reading it and seeing, does this paragraph or even this sentence make sense standalone, or do I need a lot of context to understand it? If you can't understand a sentence reading backwards through your paper, well, then that means that sentence needs to be edited or cut down or improved in some way. The sentences should have a flow, but they should also be independent. All right, we've gone over some suggestions for how to improve your writing, but I also want to make sure we're reiterating the outline for your paper. So this should be approximately 6 paragraphs. You have that intro opener paragraph. You then have 3 to 4 paragraphs in the body for your literature review. Now, you might have only written 3 paragraphs for the literature review you submitted to me, but in your introduction, you might want to build on that and add that 4th paragraph to really help tie the ideas together. And then you have your 6th paragraph, which is a hypothesis summary paragraph to make sure the reader knows what you are studying and what you think is going to happen. Over the course of 6 paragraphs, this should amount to about 3 to 4 pages in your introduction. You also want to make sure you are using 12-point font and 1-inch margins, double spaced. I recommend using Times New Roman 12-point, but there might be other fonts that work, nothing small, but your general kind of accessible 12-point fonts. I'm just going to kind of say Times New Roman is your best bet. Again, 1-inch margins, and everything is double spaced. Everything in your paper, your references section, the title page I'm about to talk about, the bodies of your papers, everything is double spaced. On your, you also want to make sure that you have citations and references in text with APA format. Again, something we talked about in Lab 3, and Lab 2 for that matter. Go back, go use Purdue OWL, whatever you need to make sure that you're doing APA correctly. You're also going to need a title page. This is a separate page at the front of your document. This has what's called a running head in the top left. This is a short version of your title. It always has running head written there in lowercase, well, starts with an uppercase R, but then lowercase. And then the entire shortened title is in uppercase letters. So here we have running head, colon, Anxiety and Health in College Students, which is a shortened form of the full article title, which is the association between anxiety and health status in college-age students. See how one is kind of a different representation of the title. This, all the running heads should fit in the top header of your document. If it doesn't, then your kind of shortened title, your running head, is too short. You then make sure you have a page number, and this running head and page number should be in your header across all pages of your document. So if you don't know how to make a header in a word processor, make sure to reach out to your TAs and they can help you with that. Then in the center of your page, of the title page, you have 4 pieces of information. You have the full title of your paper that you're writing, you have your name, you have your V number so we can track you, and you indicate the institution that you're at when you wrote this paper, which is Virginia Commonwealth University. You do not need to put a date, you do not need to put the title of the assignment, so don't have to say Introduction Paper, Psych 317, Spring 25, you don't need that information. You just need to put your institution. You also always need a references page, the same way you did for your lit review. The last page, independent page, should be a references, and it should list all of the references you made in text throughout your introduction. Reminder how to do an APA citation. You start with the last names and first initials of all of the authors in author order. You then follow it with the year, then the title of the article with sentence case, so only capitalizing the first letter of the first word. You then have the journal article in italics with capitalizing the first letter of each word, followed by the volume, maybe an issue number, and then the page number. So here's a bulleted list of the things you should be keeping in mind. I've tried to give you a little bit of practice with this already with these APA citations, but make sure you're reviewing them. And again, if you have any issues with it, reach out to your TA and they can help you. I have also included a few resources that you can use when writing your introduction paper. In the module for this week, as well as in the page for this week, I'm going to have 2 links to an introduction section guide and a sample introduction section for you to look at and review to get more information and more examples of how you are to write your introduction, what it should look like, that you can kind of emulate. You also should have been reading a number of research papers by now, at least 3, so you should see how those authors are formatting and creating flow in their introduction. You emulate that as much as possible. Now, the research you're reading, those introduction sections are going to be a lot longer. They're going to have a lot more information than what you are doing, but the general logic of a opener paragraph, a body of information, and then a closing hypothesis paragraph is going to be the same. I also want you to remember that this is going to be used in your final paper. This introduction paper is building towards your final paper. This is the same submission you're going to resubmit in a few weeks, well, more than a few weeks, in a month or so. So make sure that you're really putting the effort forward writing this paper today, because you're going to get edits on it back to help inform your final paper. So the better, more edited version you can do now is going to make sure you have less edits to do for your final paper, and you'll do even better on that final paper. Okay, so we're done talking about the introduction section, and now we're going to go back into SPSS as we do each week in lab. Today talking about how to run t-tests, which I talked about in this lab, giving you an idea of the categorical and continuous variable relationship. So if you need to, take a pause here and then make sure that you have access to SPSS. We're going to be using it for this lab. So first, let's do a quick review of t-tests from your statistics course. I mentioned today that a t-test is when you're comparing scores across 2 groups. You're trying to see, is there a systematic difference between scores based on the group that is taking that survey, whether group A has different scores than group B. And this was specifically describing an independent samples t-test, which is one form of t-test, one form of group comparison. An independent samples t-test is when you are comparing scores across 2 groups to determine whether those means are significantly different. So you'll see in here every group of scores is going to have some sort of variance. So blue group, not everybody is scoring at that line that's in the middle. That line is the average mean score for that group. So you have blue group, there is a lot of variance there. So some people are scoring really low, some people are scoring right around that average, some people are scoring much higher. But then there's also red group, which is scoring on the same continuous variable, and they have variance, and they have some people who are closer to that mean, and they have some people who are really high scorers on the variable. And what you're trying to find out is that overlap between these two groups, is that significant, or are those groups significantly different? Is the gap between those means, where the question mark arrows, is that significantly different? Again, even if there is overlap, and there's always going to be some overlap, there are going to be lower scores in the red and there's going to be high scores in the blue. But in general, are most of the blue scores lower than most of the red scores? Is the amount of variance in the blue scores lead you to believe that something systematic is happening in blue that is different than what's happening in orange-red there, such that those means are statistically significantly different from each other? Otherwise, you might have something that looks like this, where there's a lot more overlap between the red and blue scores. You can see that average for the red and blue are a lot closer together, and there's a lot more variance overlap there. The first example I gave you, there's only a little bit of overlap in the middle, but here there's a good amount of there's a good proportion of the variance that is overlapping. And so we have the question of, is the difference between those red and blue averages, those means, is that actually significant? And a t-test will answer that question. And you should always be thinking that the group is not their mean. There's lots of different scores. We are just using the mean and then using the standard deviation in part of this analysis to determine, is the overlap significant? So to run a t-test, you should go into SPSS, as we always do, into that SPSS data file Psych 317. Give you a second, pause, get it open. By now, most of you have figured out through IT services how to get access to it. If you still haven't, you definitely want to do that. You want to get access. You shouldn't be paying for it at all. You can use the library computers, which have SPSS, or you can get it on your computer by talking to IT services. All right, and open that file, and then you're good to go. So for a t-test, we are trying to understand the relationship between our continuous and categorical variables. So we need to know a little bit about our continuous and categorical variables. We are comparing those two means, the two means for each of the groups. So our categorical variable needs to have two levels, at least two, but for this analysis, we are choosing specifically two levels from our categorical variable and then relating them to our continuous. So we might have the example that we're going to use today of, does legal sex influence levels of neuroticism? Are males more or less neurotic than females, would be the question that we could answer with the data that I have. So our categorical variable would be male versus female, or it could be female-male. The order here doesn't matter. 1 and 2, this is a nominal variable, that categorical nominal. So order doesn't matter. Yes, no, light hair, dark hair, like none of these things matter in any kind of order, otherwise they would be ordinal. They just need some value attributed to it though because of SPSS. And then our continuous variable is neuroticism. But because SPSS needs those group level kind of code, it needs a value associated with which group, because it can't process male and female as information. It needs numbers to analyze. So what we do is go into SPSS and go to our variable view tab. Remember, there's a data view and a variable view. And you're going to look at the variable that you want to understand and that you're trying to analyze the groups for. And you go under the values column and you click that little blue ellipsis there to find out what the value numbers are. What are the actual numerical associations with your labels? And it'll open up this value labels, and here you'll see that the value of 1, the number 1 in your data, is associated with male in this data set, and the value of 2 is associated with female. And these values could be anything. In fact, you can change them if you want. You could set male to be 83 and female to be 72, or you could have 99 and negative 99, 0 and 1. You could do anything that you wanted here, but it is important to remember what are the value numbers associated with each of these groups. So for us, we are just going to remember that 1 is male, 2 is female. If you change this at all, then you're going to have to remember that. But for our example, 1 is male, 2 is female. I think I've said that enough times by now. 1 is male, 2 is female, because you're really going to need it on the next step. So to analyze a t-test, you are going to analyze, as we have been living in this analyze. You're then going to go down to compare means and proportions, because unlike what we've done before, which is more descriptive statistics, describing the data, and then we ran some correlations, now we are comparing means, and the proportions is referencing those standard deviations, the variance and spread. So we're comparing those to each other, and you'll have a drop down of options of ways that you can compare means. And here we're going to select independent samples t-test. You'll see that there's a few other types of t-tests, and then there's the one-way ANOVA, which is if you have more than 2 groups. But again, for us, we're just doing an independent samples t-test at this point. When we open up this independent samples t-test window, it's going to be looking for 2 pieces of information. What is our grouping variable and what is our test variable? That is equivalent to what is our categorical variable and what is our continuous variable. So let's start with our categorical variable, again known as our grouping variable in SPSS. So we will select sex and then move it on over to the grouping variable with those arrows that come over. And it will pop over into the grouping variable once you click the arrow or double click the sex variable. But you'll notice that it starts with 2 question marks in parentheses. That's because SPSS doesn't know what 2 groups you are comparing. Again, some variables might have more than 2 levels, but an independent samples t-test is only looking at a comparison between group A and group B. So you need to tell SPSS what are the groups I'm looking at in this sex variable. So you're going to click the define groups. You're going to give it a definition of which groups you're looking for. That will open a pop-up for the design groups, and here define groups, and here is where you're going to type in the values associated with each group. So remember, I said it was very important to remember what were males and what were females. Here's where you type them in. So our group 1 or group A, we're going to put 1, and we're going to remember in our mind that that is males. And then group 2, we're going to put a 2, and that is females. If you had changed it in any way, use that 83, 72, 99, whatever, you can put that in here. It's also important to know that the order of the groups doesn't matter. When you are comparing 2 things to each other, which one is higher score, lower score, we want to know there's a difference, but the actual organization of them, the order of them doesn't matter. So we could have put group 1 equals 2 and group 2 equals 1, but that might be a little confusing. So just for now, put group 1 is 1 males and group 2 is 2, which is females. You can then click continue, and you will see that the independent samples t-test window updates, and you now have sex 1 and 2 defined. The question marks are gone. You no longer have to define. All right, so that is how to get your grouping variable, your categorical variable in there. Next, we want to get our continuous variable. This is the test variable, that dependent variable that you are testing to see if there's some effect on it. So for us, we're going to use neuroticism, because remember, we're trying to figure out whether legal sex has an effect on neuroticism. So you select neuroticism, you click the arrow to bring it over, and you'll see that it migrates over to your test variable. You can include a lot of dependent variables in this window. The independent samples t-test window allows you to create put in a number of continuous variables, all of which you are seeing whether sex has an influence on those test variables. You cannot, however, put in more than 1 independent variable at this point. So that grouping variable, just 1 categorical variable, but the dependent variable, the continuous, you can have multiples here if you want to do multiple t-tests at a time. You then click OK, and you'll get your output. So here's what the output looks. You might have a couple more things depending on what options, but these are the major two tables that you are looking at. The first table, the group statistics, here's where you get the mean and standard deviation about your continuous variable based on which group. So you might have pulled your descriptive statistics about neuroticism in general, but this time it's broken apart into group A and group B. So we can see that males have an average score of 2.65. There was 34 of them in our data set. And a standard deviation, that spread of scores, of 0.97. You then have your female population who had an average score of 3.45 and a standard deviation of 0.946. There were 72 of them, by the way. So those are the information about your individual groups. And what you're trying to determine with the t-test is whether the 3.45 and the 2.65 are different. We see that they are different. Those are different numbers, but are they different enough for us to say that there is something systematic that is happening between males and females when it comes to neuroticism? You would also see in this bottom, this actual t-test table, that it has a mean difference column. This is where you see the subtraction of group A and group B. So the 0.65 and the 3.45, the 2.65 and the 3.45, those have a difference of 0.8. And you'll see here that it's the first group minus the second group. So the male score minus the female score, which is why you have a negative number there. If we had switched up the order and put females as the first group and males as the second group, then it would be a positive number because we'd taken 3.45 minus 2.65, positive 0.8. But the mean difference will always be the same absolute value. But the negatives, just keep an eye on that negatives because it informs the order of your groups for this t-test. So we've looked at kind of the information about the groups. Now we want to see, are the differences in means significant? Is that difference of 0.8 significant? Is it wide enough for us to say males and females are indeed different on neuroticism in our sample? So the first number we look at is the t-test. This is the magnitude of that difference. It's a special calculation that incorporates the standard deviation of those different groups with the means, does this big math that you learned in statistics, and we get a number. Here it is negative 4.06. So is that big? Is that small? There is you might remember from your statistics class that usually around a 1.98 becomes significant at 0.05. So this is relatively large, but you don't really need to remember what the numbers signify because that is actually going to be represented in your p-value. Oh, and before I get there, let's go to the degrees of freedom. This is how many participants you used in the data set minus 1 for each group. So you'll recall that we had 34 males and 72 females. That's up in the group statistics. So you add those two together, you get 106 participants, and then you subtract 2 for each group that you are doing. So here we have group 1 male, group 2 female, minus 2. So you get 104 degrees of freedom. Okay, but we wanted to find out whether that negative 4.06 was significant. So we look at the p-value here. It is the significance. Again, less than 0.05 is considered significant. So here we would say that 4.05 suggests that the difference of 0.8 between males and females on neuroticism is in fact significant. There is a systematic difference between neuroticism based on legal sex. Now, you do have a one-sided versus two-sided, which is something I don't want to go into a lot of detail right now, but it basically is whether you have a hypothesis about which one is higher, whether males are going to be higher in neuroticism than females, vice versa. If you have a clear hypothesis where you are guessing the direction, then you use the one-sided. But if you just are asking a general question about are they different, it could go either way. Males could be higher than females, or maybe females could be higher than males. I don't really know. Then you use the two-sided. You're looking at both. You might have heard these called one-tailed or two-tailed in your statistics course. So the p-value might matter here. But for us, we're just going to look at the two-sided version. We don't really have a hypothesis about which group is going to have more or less neuroticism. All of that output data you just pulled needs to go in your write-up. So the descriptive statistics for males and females needs to be in your write-up. For males, it was a mean of 2.65 and a standard deviation of 0.97, whereas females had the 3.45 mean and a standard deviation of 0.95. You also want to include in your write-up the significance and the direction. So if you found a significant t-test, then you can say, yes, one group was higher than the other, had a higher score. But if it is non-significant, then you would indicate there was no significant difference in scores between the two groups. Now, if it was significant, then you need to look at the direction, which is positive or negative. Only look at the direction if it was significant. If it was non-significant, then there is no difference, and so you don't need to write anything. Even if it looks like, okay, there was a mean difference, if it was not a significant mean difference, then you don't say anything about the direction. They just aren't different. If it was significant, you have positive or negative. Positive means that group A in your analysis had a higher score than group B, because when you subtract a higher score, if you subtract a lower score from a higher score, you get a positive number. Whereas negative t-statistics means that group B's score was higher than group A. So in our example, we have males, which was the 2.65, was lower than the 3.45. In this case, group B, the female group, had a higher score than group A, and that's why we got a negative t-statistic. You then have an interpretation. What is this difference in terms of data? So again, that direction, the higher, lower, and the statistical values that you pulled from your output. So to review, our write-up would be, we found males, descriptive statistics, reported lower neuroticism than females, descriptive statistic of females, and then our statistics, which is your T with the degrees of freedom in parentheses, followed by the actual T value. In our case, it was negative 4.06, and then the significant P value, which in our case for the two-tailed was less than 0.001. Because t-tests are comparing two groups, and I've said many times that the order doesn't matter, you could also write this up a different way. You could switch the positive-negative interpretation. So you could look at the exact same data and write that we found females, mean of 3.45, reported higher neuroticism than males, which had a mean of 2.65. You see how that's different from the previous write-up, which had lower neuroticism for males? Now we have higher neuroticism from females. It's the same thing, it's just written a different way. But because we've switched kind of which group is the first group and which group is the second group in our write-up, we also need to switch our t-statistic to indicate whether it's a positive or negative direction. So here we would say T of 104 equals positive 4.06 with the same p-value of less than 0.001. It's really up to you how you want to write it. The data is the same either way because order doesn't matter. All right, that's it. That was the SPSS. There's a little bit more with t-tests that we can go into, the Levene statistic and what to do with some of the effect size data that appeared in your output, but we're not going to deal with that this week, maybe in the future. Instead, we're going to go on next week to writing a methods section, and we're going to have our first look at the survey data that you all filled out. That's it. Have a great week.